I ended the last video with the words, sexual repression was the answer to a problem. Now, I hope that made you puzzled. I hope you were feeling lost actually, because I think it's a very crucial part for understanding the historical overview of human sexuality. So before moving on to the next stage, maybe let's elaborate a little bit on that. So first of all, why am I talking about problems and answers? Well, very simple. Development is all about facing a problem, finding a solution, continuing until you get across the next problem. And we see that in so many things in life. For example, computer people, IT experts, when they suddenly find some kind of problem, a security problem in software or something like that, what do? Well, they just create some kind of patch to solve it. But what happens, as a matter of fact, this patch itself, the solution of the problem, after some time turns out not to be perfect either. And actually, this solution is the source of a new problem. So they have to create new patches to solve the problems that these old patches had created, and so on and so on. We see the same thing, for example, in medicine. Imagine you have a medical problem and suddenly you need to get surgery, or maybe you get some antibiotics that are very, very strong. But as a result of that intervention, you have some side effects. You may have a headache, or you may have diarrhea or something else, or a high blood pressure. So what do? The doctors, they just give you some other medicines just to cope with the side effects. But again, these medicine that you're getting, they may create some kind of new problems. And then you have to take even more medicine. So what you see quite often is people who have some very serious diseases, at the end they suffer more from the medicine, from treating the side effects of the first medicine, than really from the first problem itself. And of course that doesn't mean that it's bad, but it is just part of understanding how things develop. Also in human society, if we're looking at our environment, for example, in the 18th, 19th century, for example, whale oil was used very much just for light, for candles or something like that. But so many whales had been hunted and killed that there were not that many whales left, and they had to go further and further and further, and it became more dangerous to catch new whales. So suddenly they found a solution: petroleum. And as they were extracting the petroleum from these underground reservoirs, it became cheaper and cheaper, so we could take more and more and more. But this created new problems. This created environmental problems, and suddenly we have all this renewable energy that comes up. Renewable energy is basically the solution to a problem, and this problem was actually the result of the solution of the previous problem. So it's highly likely that also renewable energy in 50 or 100 years will actually become the source of a new problem. So as we can see, everything in development, and also human development, it's all about solutions that are found to previous problems. So let's go back to sex. In the previous stage, the red stage, so basically the humans that were living already in a sedentary way as a result of the agricultural revolution, there you had the sexual repression of women, but not of men. So what problem did they actually try to tackle with this? The aim was probably not just to limit the sexual pleasure of women. Was there a problem really with that? Probably not. Most likely, in the stage before red, so in the purple stage, so when people were hunter-gatherers or horticultural, basically these groups started getting too big. And basically the social safety nets just started breaking down. And basically that meant that in terms of care, every household started relying on themselves, and there was less reliance on other households or going beyond the own family. Because let's not think that the household was a household like we have it now, father, mother and two kids. No, these were extended families. But still, these extended families could suffer, and there was not necessarily much support beyond that. So people really had to choose who they wanted to support, who they wanted to care for. And that meant they needed to know who is who. They wanted to be sure that the kids were really their own offspring. So limiting the sexuality of women was actually a pragmatic solution. Indeed, there may have been some evil men who were very protective of their own women and so on, but most likely it was also the mothers, the grandmothers, aunts, sisters and so on who were actually perpetuating this whole value system. And of course, this was a solution, but the solution after some time becomes a problem on its own. So in this video, we're going to see how this solution was the start of a new problem. Basically, in the red stage, or the stage where people were focused on power and trying to accumulate resources, there was too much individuality. There were too many struggles. It was not safe. There was no mutual support. But if we're looking at the human species, humans are actually incredibly weak. I mean, if you would encounter a wild cat and you have to fight it, I mean, chances that you are going to win from it if you don't have any weapons or anything like that. It's pretty small, even if you get attacked by a rat, for example. Humans, the success of human survival lies in their cooperation. So in this red stage, there was not enough cooperation. And that actually led to an existential problem for the survival of the human species. So what we're going to see in this video is how this actually led to forced monogamy. So basically, what I'm going to tell you in this lesson, there is nothing romantic about monogamy. It's a very, very pragmatic thing. It's not about a soul connection. It's not about some kind of divine natural order. It's not about love. The roots of marital and sexual monogamy are purely rooted in finding a pragmatic solution for a societal problem. So again, no value statements. Monogamy is neither good or bad. It's just something that has its own consequences. So let's now really dive into this next stage, which in spiral dynamics is the fourth stage, and it's the blue stage. And it probably started about 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. And as I said, in the previous stage, there was too much chaos. Suddenly, there was no more real development. And in order to find stability, humans really needed to cooperate again. So how could people cooperate? Because these settlements and already first cities were getting so big and people didn't know each other. Actually, this led to the creation of the first states. Most often these were like city-states or city-states that later expanded into a larger territory. And these states, in order to be ruled, they needed to have a ruler, some kind of governmental system, maybe a council of elders. And this would be very formalized. So they would also have laws, but in order to make sure that everybody would know these laws, they would somehow be written down and they could be passed on from generation to generation, and you could really refer to them. It was no longer a matter of passing on an oral law and then having questions of like, oh, is this really oral law or is it not oral law? No, the laws were codified. Everybody who was able to read, of course, or had access to somebody who could read, had access to these laws. There was already, this stage also led to an enforcement system of the laws, because it's very nice if you have laws, but if they're not implemented, you can't do very much. So also in this stage, together with these laws, is also the creation of values, the system of some kind of normative framework. Morality becomes very important. And another very interesting development is the spiritual development. In the previous stage, where people were all seeking power, quite often the most powerful ascribed some kind of divine power to themselves. There were gods, and often these gods were not human, but there were also these kind of half gods, and quite often the rulers thought that they were some kind of god on earth or something like that, and this gave them some kind of divine power. But in the next stage, so in the blue stage, when people started living under states and very structured societies with their own bureaucracies, real religions with a non-human god appeared. The god was far above the people, and there was a very good reason for that. Basically, if the god or the divine power is living on earth, you can just agree with him. You could pay him money and he's just going to tell you, okay, fine, you can do whatever you want. But whereas if the god is far beyond, you cannot get to an agreement with him. You cannot just settle something. There is no possibility to play corruption with the divine power. And basically the other thing is that if people are not afraid of punishment in this life, then why wouldn't they do it? I mean, if you can kill somebody and you're amoral, you don't mind killing somebody, then why wouldn't you do it? But with the arrival of these religions and these gods, also the concept of the afterlife or hell came up. If you know that you do something wrong and you're going to burn in hell forever, and even after that, for eternity, you will be burning, you will be suffering, then you will be thinking twice before you do something. Maybe one more thing that I want to say is that in this stage, humans go for more and more civilization. The concept of being civilized becomes more important. Now, as we already saw, civilization basically means turning your back to nature. So in this stage, people indeed turn their back more and more to the laws of nature, and that also means denying the human needs, including the sexual needs. So, the previous stage, the red stage, is still seen in some societies in the world. For example, if you look at very closed off mountain societies, I mean, I'm thinking, for example, of many of the ethnic groups in the Caucasus, for example, the Chechens, the Ingush, Dagestanis, and so on. They really live still according to these red values. But if we're looking at the blue values, also these we can still see very much. We can see these, for example, in very religious environments. For example, in the Bible Belt in the US or in parts of Canada that are still very conservative in religious terms. But also in the Middle East, we still get across many societies that are very, very religious, and where the law of God and the word of and the principles of the religion are the most important. You can go to these people and try to prove something with science, and they will say, yes, I understand that this is what science says, but I don't accept it because there is another authority which is more important than science to me. So again, there is no good and bad, because all of these value systems are just a way to survive. So, what about sex in this stage of human development? Let's start with looking at marital systems. Marriages are still mainly monogamous or polygynous, but there is a big mentality shift. Women are no longer considered as some kind of property. There's still something residual, but the ownership of women is no longer the core thing. The main thing about marriage is that it's some kind of promise in front of God. It's a promise that two people will take care of each other and their offspring. Why? Actually, this was also a solution. Remember that in the previous stage, people were very, very individualistic. They just cared about themselves. And of course, as men were having most of the power, there were many situations where when a man didn't like his wife anymore, he could just kick her on the street. When she was not able to bear children, if she was not strong enough, he could just throw her out on the street, and he didn't have a sense of responsibility towards her. Whereas in this new stage, by making a promise in front of God that you will take care of this person, there are some big consequences. Because if you kick out your wife because you don't like her anymore, you're actually going to go to hell. So again, it's very important to see this, the consequences, this cause and effect. Now, another important thing was that Red was actually a pretty unfair system. People, men who were rich and powerful, they could afford to have more wives. They could have 10, 20 wives, and this is where this whole concept of a harem actually comes from. But the poor people, the ones who had no power, the ones who were not able to really fight, they often ended up without having any wife at all, and this really led to some kind of major disbalances. It led to power disbalances, but also many people were unhappy. And if you have many unhappy people, if the people who are working for you, if they're unhappy, then you're going to have a challenge. So something new needs to be thought of. And this is where the solution of forced monogamy came up. It's basically a very egalitarian and very democratic system. If you say that every man can only have one wife, then there is not going to be a fight for having more of these female resources. And this is what most of the religions actually imposed. They basically said every man can only have one wife, but of course they made some exceptions. And that was basically for the royalty. Quite often, and you can still read about that if you're looking, for example, at the Russian Tsars, even in the 10th, 11th century, they still had more than one wife, even though they had already converted to Christianity. But of course, gradually also this system was abandoned. Now in Islam, they took a different approach. They kept to polygyny. There basically they said that if you can afford it, you can have more than one wife. What's the reason for that? Very simple. Islam was very expansionist, and many of the young men just went abroad in order to trade, and they would find a wife there. So there was really a surplus of women in their own territory, and that allowed them actually to have several wives. Something similar happened with the Mormons in the first few decades of the existence of the religion, because so many young men became missionaries and traveled far away in order to convert new people to their religion, and they were gone for many, many years, that suddenly you had so many women who were left and there were no men. So that allowed them to have some kind of polygynous system. But later also the Mormons have changed their system of the missionaries, so this is why it's no longer allowed. So what are the impacts of this marital system and the new values on pre, extra and post-marital sex? First of all, virginity becomes something divine, and it's linked to the virtue of sexual asceticism, the virtue of not having sex. So we see that virgins are idealized, and this is also why we see, for example, the Virgin Mary. The mother of Jesus was a virgin. But actually, Jesus was not the only one who was born out of a virgin. Many rulers also claim to have a similar story, even before Jesus. For example, Alexander the Great or Emperor August. They all have a very similar story. And the other thing about premarital sex is that suddenly there is equality. The virginity is not only important for women, but suddenly also for men. Now, what about extramarital sex? Also there we see a little bit of a change. First of all, equality for men and women. But secondly, extramarital sex is forbidden in all cases. Even consensual extramarital sex is no longer allowed. And it goes even so far that it's not only the sexual act which is punishable, but even thinking about sex with somebody else, even looking at somebody with the idea that I would like to have sex with this person, is already seen as a sin. Why is that? Very simple. It is just in order to really scare the people, in order not to take it one step further and to make sure that this sexual monogamy stays in place. Now, what about postmarital sex when somebody is a widow or a widower? There are some different systems here. For example, in Islam, what happened quite often was that when a man died, basically his brother or maybe a cousin would take over his wife and his family. And again, this is not about sex, this is purely about the function of care. Basically, the brother or the cousin would say that I have additional resources and I am going to take care of the family of my deceased brother. In Christianity, it was a little bit more difficult, but quite often if somebody became a widow or a widower or an orphan, they would either be taken by their extended family or actually the church would take care of them. Suddenly, the church, or also in Islam, the Ummah, became something like the new social safety net that was not there in the previous stage. So now let's look at prostitution. Formally, prostitution is not allowed in any of these major religions, and it was not allowed in any of these societies in this stage. However, there were some kind of loopholes that could be found. For example, infidel women could be used as sex slaves. And if we are looking, for example, at what happened with ISIS, with the Islamic State, quite often when they were capturing non-Muslim women, they would just be used as sex slaves or they would even just be sold off. Also in Iran, there is still the concept of sire, which is some kind of temporary marriage. Basically, it's some kind of form of prostitution, you could say, because you can just go to the clergy as a man together with a woman and say that I want to marry this woman for the period of 2 hours, 1 day, maybe a month, it could be a year. And basically for the whole duration of this marriage, the man is responsible and has to take care of this woman. And if she gets pregnant during this period of time, then he will have to take care of the offspring. However, it didn't happen, and even now it doesn't happen very often that people have a marriage for a year and they extend it with another few years and then they make it some kind of indefinite contract. No, it's mainly just a tool for a night or a couple of days. And it's basically some kind of religious loophole to justify prostitution. Now, sexual orientation and gender identity. Very strictly, only heterosexuality is seen as normal. All the rest is seen as devious. Gender identity was basically a non-issue because identity of the people was mainly focused on either their nation or their religious background or anything like that. People did not identify themselves with their sexual orientation or how they were feeling. Were they feeling as a man or as a woman? Another decay happened in the area of sexual education. Basically, sexual education was almost non-existent, and sex became such a topic that it was not even talked about. On the contrary, if you wanted to know something about sex, some people would actually turn to the clergy, but the clergy was not necessarily knowledgeable. If we're looking in Christianity, for example, in Catholicism, priests are supposed to be celibate, so they basically have the same sexual knowledge and background as a pre-puberal boy, but they have no practical experience in order to share their own wisdom on this very important topic. So what happened was that actually most people had no clue about sex or sexuality until the moment they got married. And of course, this must have led to quite some problems. So now let's look at sex and spirituality. For most religions, sex and spirituality are incompatible. So if we're looking at Christianity, for example, this is very much the case. Islam, Judaism are maybe a little bit more open-minded about this. But there is one thing that's very interesting, basically. all of these religions are completely oversexed. Just look at the Bible. Just look at the Old Testament. You'll read anything from rape, incest, sexual orgies, and so on and so on. Also, if you look at the 10 Commandments, I mean, these were the 10 most important laws that every person should know. And 2 out of these 10 commandments relate to sex. Now, another interesting thing about spirituality is that suddenly celibacy, sexual asceticism becomes some kind of virtue. And in many religions, in order to be part of the clergy, you need to be celibate. For example, in Christianity, in the Catholic Church, a priest cannot be married. Also, if we're looking in the Orthodox faith, a priest can be married, but if you go higher up the hierarchy, you should lead a celibate life. And of course, religion is very punitive, it's very repressive towards sex. For example, masturbation suddenly becomes bad and it's punished by God. Or if you're not a virgin anymore, by the time you get married, it's bad, you will be punished by God. There's very, very strict visions in these religions about what sex is and how sex should be. And many of these religions see sex only as a tool for reproduction, for procreation, not for pleasure. Basically, the pleasure of the body is considered to be bad, and suddenly many of these religions start separating the body from the soul. Basically, if you have too much sex, your soul is going to suffer. Now, why is that like that? I mean, why do religions suddenly come up with this kind of point of view that having sexual pleasure is bad? It's basically born out of the trauma of the previous stage. Remember that in red, in this very individualistic time, people were just looking at their own pleasure, their own way of life. Now, what happens if people are focusing too much on their own pleasures? If they're only thinking about themselves, then suddenly things get out of control. And there's a challenge that if you give people the chance to really enjoy sexual pleasure, they're actually going to degrade and they will go back to red. They're going to fall back into this individual mindset. It'll be again some kind of chaos. So basically, the sexual repression is just some kind of safeguard from preventing society to degrade back to a system of power games, power struggles, and so on. Now, it's very interesting. If we are comparing this blue, this fourth stage, with the purple second stage, the stage of the hunter-gatherers, we see that they're almost quite opposite in terms of sex and spirituality, because in purple, sex and spirituality are entirely linked with each other. You cannot separate them. Hunter-gatherers and horticulturalists, they basically celebrated sex, and basically they thought that sexual asceticism is something that's not normal. Now, in this fourth blue stage, suddenly sex becomes something bad, and celibacy becomes some kind of virtue. And here we really see this contradiction between culture and civilization on one side, and nature on the other side. So let's finish this video with a short look at the main sexual values and norms that existed in this stage. First of all, sexual morality is one of the cornerstones of society. It's all about doing the right thing or the wrong thing. And here it's actually pretty interesting, I think, to look at types 1, 2, and 6, and we will look at those later in this course. Because types 1, 2, and 6, they're more related to the superego, or they're listening more to it. Now, another interesting value or norm is that there is a very strong regulation of what is allowed and what is not allowed. So there is very concrete prescriptions about oral sex, which is forbidden, or anal sex, which is forbidden, or masturbation, which is also forbidden. And actually, in some cases, there were even very concrete prescriptions of how people should have sex, in which positions they should do it. And maybe one final thing that is extremely important is the emergence of sexual shame. In the previous stage, in red, we already had guilt, but suddenly shame comes up. And what's the difference between guilt and shame? It looks very subtle, but it's actually immense. In guilt, you know that you did something wrong. And if you do the wrongdoing, you just try to restore it. You could just give money, or maybe you could do something, you could pay a service or something like that, but you can get rid of the guilt. Shame is something you cannot get rid of, because in shame, it's not about doing something wrong, it's about being wrong. It's about feeling that something is inherently wrong about who you are. And this shame is actually a very important tool for sexual repression. If you can make sure that people feel ashamed for having sexual needs, then they will always feel that there's something wrong and they're never going to try to dominate others. They will be very subdued. And actually here we can speak about some kind of psychological castration. And it's very important in this stage, because this blue stage of human development is all about having structures, about people obeying to the laws, people obeying to these structures. And in order to obey, it's very good when people are loyal and fearful. And this is actually exactly what castration does. When you castrate an animal, it'll become very obedient. It'll become very loyal. It'll fear that you may do something wrong to it. But at the same time, this animal gains and it maintains its strength, and it's really going to support you. So the same happens in psychological castration. When the flow of the libido is somehow blocked, people will have the same sense of castration, and they will be fearful, but they will be loyal to the system. And this was actually, again, the solution to a big problem. And as we will see, becomes the source of a new problem.